Over the skies of southern Africa, a brand new jet vanished mid-flight without a word from the crew. The reason would prove more unsettling than anyone imagined. Investigators uncovered a chain of events so disturbing that new rules were written to prevent it from happening again. Now, today, those rules are gone, and the millions who fly each day are unaware of just how thin the line of trust truly is. This is the story of Flight 470. On the 29th of November 2013, Flight 470 was preparing for departure from Maputo, Mozambique, to Luanda, Angola. The aircraft, a brand new Embraer E-190, had 27 passengers and 6 crew members for what should have been a routine 3.5-hour flight north across southern Africa. Flight 470 was operated by LAM Mozambique Airlines. At the time, due to safety concerns around oversight and maintenance standards in the country, all airlines certified in Mozambique were banned from European airspace. At 11:26 a.m., Flight 470 took off from Maputo International Airport. The climb was smooth, and before long, they had leveled off at their assigned altitude of 38,000 feet. Weather along the route was fair, with some scattered clouds well below the jet's cruising altitude. The captain, 49-year-old Herminio dos Santos Fernandes, was a veteran with over 9,000 hours of flight experience, including 2,500 hours on the Embraer E-190. The first officer, 24-year-old Gracio Chimoquale, had logged around 1,400 flight hours, a young but capable pilot, however, new to the Embraer. Uneventful, the first 52 minutes of flight passed without a hitch. At 12:18 p.m., air traffic control in Botswana contacted the crew, asking for their estimated time to the next waypoint. The crew of Flight 470 advised they expected to reach it in 1 hour. The controller acknowledged and advised them he would contact them then. However, within that hour, the controller became overwhelmed with his workload. His radar had lit up with aircraft, calls were coming in from every direction, and coordination filled the airwaves. Swamped in his work, he hadn't noticed something unusual happening with Flight 470. It was an hour later, as scheduled, the controller in Botswana attempted to contact the crew again. However, all he got was silence, and repeated calls went unanswered. It was then that he realized Flight 470 had disappeared from radar. There had been no emergency call, no deviation reported, and no sign of mechanical problems. For a brand new jet to disappear mid-cruise, it was highly unusual. Although search teams were organized, worsening weather forced them to wait until morning. Everyone's worst fears were realized the following morning when the wreckage of Flight 470 was located in Namibia's Wapwata National Park. The impact had torn apart the aircraft, fire had broken out, and all 33 people on board were dead. The investigation was conducted by Namibia's Directorate of Aircraft Accident Investigations, with assistance from their Mozambique counterpart, the NTSB, as well as Embraer from Brazil and Brazil's NTSB equivalent. Both the flight deck data and voice recorders were recovered from the crash site and sent to the United States for analysis. Back at the crash site, 2 impression marks in the soil, stretching for hundreds of meters, showed the engines had struck the ground first. This told investigators 2 things. The plane had hit the ground intact and relatively level. For investigators, this was curious. No mayday, a modern jet, a near-level first impact, and a brand new aircraft. What had brought down Flight 470? Was it an engine failure? Marks on the turbines showed they were working at the time of impact. Fuel exhaustion? Only halfway through the journey, this was unlikely. An emergency landing for some other reason? Probably not, as the landing gear was still retracted. To investigators, nothing made sense. Then, once the voice and data recorders were downloaded and examined, the investigation took a shocking turn. At 11:26 a.m., Flight 470 took off from Maputo Airport with 33 on board. 12:18 p.m., the crew confirms their expected arrival at the following waypoint to ATC. Then, at 2 minutes past 1 p.m., the captain is captured on the flight deck voice recorder asking the first officer if he would like to step out and use the bathroom. The first officer replies yes, gets up, leaves the flight deck, and shuts the door behind him, in violation of company policy requiring that 2 people be on the flight deck at all times. Now, alone in the flight deck, Captain Fernandez begins a series of puzzling inputs. According to the flight deck data recorder, he moved the auto throttle to idle, changed the altitude selector from 38,000 to just 592 feet, a value below terrain level. He deployed the speed brakes, putting the aircraft into a 6,000 feet per minute descent, and set the auto throttle to idle. Moments later, the recorder captures the sound of banging on the flight deck door, presumably the first officer trying to re-enter. The ground proximity warning system is then heard, calling for an immediate climb that would never come. At 1:16 p.m., 6 minutes after the descent began, Flight 470 impacts the ground wings level, sliding for 400 meters and bursting into flames. Everybody on board is killed. To investigators, the recorders had left no doubt. The actions by the captain, whilst alone on the flight deck, had taken a healthy airplane from cruise to a sustained, high-speed, controlled descent into the ground. For his colleagues and the families of the victims, the hardest question was why. The search for motive found some context, but little certainty. His son had taken his own life a year earlier, his youngest daughter was in the midst of heart surgery, and he was in the middle of divorce proceedings that were unresolved for over a decade. But whether this would have caused a man to do what he did, no one will ever know. However, not everyone accepted the findings. Mozambique's Association of Air Operators argued that the captain's inputs matched the procedures for an emergency descent specified by Embraer, suggesting he was responding to a fault. Investigators disagreed, finding that the deliberate altitude selections, door locking, and the sustained descent did not reflect an emergency recovery, but rather a controlled path to impact. The alternative theory was likely little more than an attempt to shift the financial responsibility for its member, rather than a technical alternative. The tragedy of Flight 470 began with a bathroom break, one man at the controls, a locked door, and a series of deliberate inputs that sent a fully functioning brand new aircraft hurtling toward the ground. For 32 of the 33 people on board, the descent was silent and inescapable. The industry would again feel the shock just over a year later, when an Airbus A320 in Europe went down under similar circumstances. Germanwings Flight 9525 crashed when the first officer locked out the captain and commanded a controlled descent into the mountains. In the immediate aftermath of that tragedy, authorities moved to require that 2 authorized people be on the flight deck at all times, a policy that has since been reversed. Today, on almost all domestic flights, each time a pilot leaves the flight deck, that same vulnerability quietly returns.